Hey, everybody. Folks are piling in right now, so I want to say thank you. Really excited for our talk today. It'll be on, water policy in California. So we're really excited. It'll be, hold on, folks. Got a little bit of echo. Really excited. Today we have Steve Greenhut. Steve is the Western Region Director for R Street Institute. So he covers a bunch of states on the west part of the country. Also writes for the Orange County Register. Is also on the editorial board of the Southern California News Group. And Steve's a longtime veteran journalist. Has covered the Capitol. Used to write for newspapers down south. So, Steve, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so let's get into it. We only have 30 minutes. I feel like we could easily blow by 30 minutes with one of these questions, but let's go right for it. So the title of your book, a new book you just wrote, Winning the Water Wars. Can you give attendees an overview, the nature of these water wars? Who are the players? What are the competing interests? Kind of set the stage for us before we dive in.
Sure. Well, here I'll show the book right here, and
beautiful book.
Yeah, and so anyway, I've always been interested in water policy, and as a journalist, we've covered it in piecemeal, and it was an interesting project to really get to try to put the whole puzzle together. And I traveled around the state and did a lot of the photography and visited a lot of the water projects that I had always wanted to visit. So, we know that water's always been a source of conflict in California, and it's providing enough water is linked with the state's history and growth. And the state we have almost 40 million people, and that growth, that size, the fifth largest economy, our legislators always like to talk about. I mean, it never could have been that way had we not invested in the kind of infrastructure that has allowed the state to grow. And I had a really short passage about the great Sacramento floods of the 1850s, and this area was entirely flood prone. There was a huge lake that went all the way through the Central Valley, and Orange County was largely flooded. So in many ways, one water expert I talked to talked about how we really did turn the state into a giant plumbing system. And that's kind of reality. And with the Central Valley Project, which is the federal project, and the State Water Project, and the Colorado River Project, and we have created this amazing plumbing system that has allowed our state to be what it is. And of course, with anything with scarce resources, there's always going to be fighting over who gets what, and it's a big government controlled projects. So there's always going to be those kind of fights. Ironically, I get more shrugs about water, the topic, when I'm in Southern California, and I write for Southern California newspaper. So I was just down there talking about some things, and the southern areas have done a better job capturing the water than the northern areas, even though we get, the top third of the state gets 2/3 of the water, and the bottom third it's in reverse. But Northerners, of course, view the Southerners as stealing their water. But I remember during the drought, the San Diego Water Authority had so much water that it was actually dumping water out of the reservoirs. And so meanwhile, I have a section in the book from New Melones reservoir out here, where we were dumping water to save a handful of fish, which would have been eaten on their way out to the Pacific Ocean anyway. And I use that kind of as an entree to discuss the key battle, which has become not so much ag interests and urban interests, which were the traditional battles, but between human uses and environmental uses. And that seems to be the big battle, the fish versus people, the binaries that the environmentalists talk about. But the way I see it, and one of the themes of the book, is that a lot of it is about using water as growth control. And there's an ideology that underlies the conflict, which is whether we focus more on meeting human needs or letting more of the state go wild. And in many cases, the salmon are really just the proxy for the bigger issue over, what kind of state we're going to have and whether we're going to focus more on people or environmental issues. And just as a side point, a lot of our focus on environmental issues hasn't really improved the environment or boosted the fish populations along the way.
Well, let's go maybe back to the creation of all this. You write about California's shift. It had a can-do attitude. You even praise Jerry Brown's father, Pat Brown, who is really the founder of a lot of water infrastructure. What kind of projects did Brown build and put in place, and what other leaders contributed to California's infrastructure in the past?
Well, the state water project is really, one of the key projects. And I quote here from the California Museum, and really it applies to not just water, but the state in general, this, can-do attitude versus this age of limits that became more prominent in the 70s. It said, Pat Brown ushered in a golden age, making California famous for having the biggest water system, the best higher education, the longest highways, and an economy exceeding that of nations. And like I said, we see this in everything, and it's this mentality. In fact, going through a lot of the old water books, like I've got this, the original, well, not original, the 1957, the California Water Plan. And if we look at a lot of the thinkers, the builders of the state early on, they just had this attitude of, we're going to tame nature, and we're going to create the infrastructure needed to meet a rapidly growing state. And now some of the ideas were absurd, right? There was this idea for this big squirt where we would shoot water cannons, and there wasn't much concern at all about leaving rivers wild. And I'm not advocating in the book for just damming every last waterway possible, but there was this kind of optimistic vision that got pared back in the 1970s. And then, over the years, we see with some of the different federal acts that the focus increasingly shifted towards letting water flow freely, towards the ocean more and more, as we fight over smaller portions of water for not just agriculture, but for residential and commercial uses. So I quote in the book, and this is just from a letter to the editor that Pat Brown sent. It was in the 1980s, and I think it just epitomized his straightforward approach. He said, when I became governor in 1959, I knew that the problem of water conservation and delivery had to be solved. We proposed and passed a bond issue of $1.7 billion to build the California Water Project. This was the largest statewide bond issue in this or any other state. And anyway, he just goes on to say, if we had not built the Oroville Dam, the Edmund G. Brown Aqueduct, and the San Luis Reservoir, California would be facing a tremendous water shortage. And that's kind of the problem. Our population has doubled since the 1970s, and we haven't built any major new infrastructure in that time. So, I was reading what one environmentalist was looking at in the midst of the drought, and I quote him in the book. He was looking at the snowpack, which was down, the Sierra snowpack, and said, it's not a matter of infrastructure. Well, look, there's no snow up there. There's no water. But that kind of thinking just it suggests that we're never going to have a rainy year again. And the idea is to capture more water when it's a wet year, and so that we have more water available when it's a dry year. So the Metropolitan Water District, which is in the north, is viewed as something like Satan, it seems, but they have they're also the biggest landholder in the Delta. They big gulp, little sip. So during wet years, you capture more, you take a little bit more, and you build it up so that you have it during dry years. And so I go through some of the history of the different projects in the book, and make the point that it's more a matter of attitude than engineering. I mean, the engineering has gotten better in the ensuing years. Mm-hmm. And, so I'm not advocating for just damming everything, but in that, taking more water as we can and improving infrastructure and embracing a number of innovative water ideas that provide more supply. And if we feed more supply into the system, that benefits people and it benefits it benefits fish habitats too, and it beats rationing and extreme conservation. We've done well on conservation, nothing wrong with conservation,
Yeah.
but you've got to feed more water into the system.
And what, I mean, you've kind of hit on, we're going to talk about your intro. It talked a lot about, abundance over scarcity. And that's really the whole point of your book, is kind of what you just said. We have the water. It's just where it goes and if it's conserved or if it's flushed out. What kind of projects or infrastructure do you talk about in your book that would help with this, that would help with water storage?
Right. Well, I start, one crucial statistic to get to that is, about 50% of the water flows freely to the sea. 40% goes to ag, 10% to urban, 5.7% is for residential. So we seem to be focusing on, focusing on the conservation elements. We're narrowing down on that small portion, which is kind of a point of diminishing returns. Now, some of the water included in the 50% number is water that doesn't really drain into the system. It's in some of the wild rivers, but it's still a pretty useful number. I quote this one blogger, pseudonymous blogger, Scott Alexander, has this pretty well-known blog. So he points out, if all savings from rationing and conservation amount to 20% of our residential use, that's 10% of the water used to irrigate alfalfa. So, so we're fighting over these small portions. And then I quote him here. He says, "I realize that paying people subsidies to misuse water to grow unprofitable crops and then offering them counter subsidies to not take your first set of subsidies is, to say the least, a very creative way to spend government money. But the point is, it's better than what we're doing now. And that's what we're doing now, is the focus on conservation and portfolio projects, which is what our governor's focused on, which are fine, but they're small projects to eke extra drops of water out of the system. So, I look at some infrastructure projects. So, Temperance Flats, it was proposed near Fresno. It only got a small portion of money from the SB1 water bond. And that's one that had been on the books for a long time. Sites Reservoir has been on the drawing board for 20 years over in Colusa Glen County area. There was a plan that's now scuttled to raise Lake Shasta, which was designed to be 200 feet taller than it is now. And there was a plan to raise it by 18.5 feet. And that ran into, environmental problems and a variety of criticism. The state recently boosted the size of Folsom Dam to deal with flood control issues, but that shows, these little incremental changes can certainly help. We've also done a poor job. The state's also done a poor job of maintaining the infrastructure that it has. There's a lot of work that needs to go into the existing conveyance systems. We saw a couple years ago the spillway problems over at Oroville, and as we talked yesterday, but they were able to. There's never have time or money to fix anything, but somehow managed after the near disaster to, in 2 years, and I think what it was like $1 billion later, we're able to rebuild the spillways. So SB1 or Proposition 1 provided some infrastructure money, but we haven't really spent a whole lot of money on these infrastructure projects. And then we can go into some of the other ideas that are outside of infrastructure, but there's a lot that could be done on infrastructure that's certainly more cost effective than money spent on the high-speed rail line. So a lot of it is about priorities. Are we focused on maintaining and expanding the infrastructure that we have that's so vital to the future of the state, or are we more interested in kind of pie-in-the-sky projects that don't make a lot of sense?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on, I wanted to talk about innovation, but you talked a little bit about Governor Newsom's portfolio. Can you go into a little more about that, and really, A, how California views the state, and B, he released this new water portfolio. I think it fell on deaf ears because of coronavirus and it kind of got buried. But what is this big portfolio that was this big announcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the governor's been, sending a number of mixed messages. I mean, it's more of a local projects and conservation combined with some groundwater storage and small ideas that are all perfectly fine. But he's also he vetoed SB1, which would have made it, which would have created quite a few problems on the for water agencies that were negotiating voluntary agreements. And there's been some mixed messages there. But when I read his plan, and even compared to Jerry Brown's last plan, I don't see a lot of bold ideas for expanding infrastructure. I mean, even Jerry Brown talked about the need for desalination, for the need for expanding water storage. And, instead we see lawsuits against the federal government, over competing biological opinions that determine how much more water is going from the delta out to the sea versus to the agricultural community.
And on that note, on federal policies, maybe give us a little brief look at what has the Fed's role been since the Trump administration came in 2016, and maybe if there's anything there, a little preview of what a Biden administration could bring.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration has certainly pushed back with Interior Secretary David Bernhardt. He issued a memo. It seemed to be opposing some of the dam removal projects up on the Klamath River, and now those projects were more for hydropower, and there's some arguments to be made for taking down those dams. But also the Trump administration has been much more willing to send more water to the agricultural community, and I think if we get a Biden administration, we're going to end up with more the way things were before, which is more of the focus on some of the environmental priorities.
In some of your comments, SB1 was kind of a rebuke of what Trump had been pushing, correct? Either with biological opinions or voluntary agreements. SB1 was kind of a way to push back against Trump, and Trump
Right.
proposed Shasta. He was in favor of increasing the size of Shasta, which basically got stopped in his tracks.
Right, and Westland Water District, the big player, ended up opposing that in the end, and they're and any proposals, there's legitimate discussions about cost effectiveness.
Sure.
Clearly the Trump administration is pushing for more water for the agricultural community, and and then we have a new SGMA, the new state groundwater law, which is certainly defensible, because as farm interests have had less access to water, they've been pumping water from groundwater sources, and that creates subsidence. And it's also a tragedy of the commons issue, where if those with the biggest pumps get the most water, but there are a lot of farms, especially in the southern San Joaquin Valley, that really don't have any access to water from the canals and from the water project, and that makes them even more dependent. And I have there was a study from David Sunding. I've got it here. I'm gonna just find where. The problems with SGMA. He writes that the likely effects of the new groundwater control law are 992,000 fallowed acres, lost crop revenue of $7.2 billion, and lost operating income of $1.9 billion in the San Joaquin Valley. And he predicts a loss of 42,000 farm jobs and more than 65,000 total jobs in the area, given the degree to which the farm economy is dependent, the whole economy is dependent on the farm economy, and that the impacts are highly regressive, because it's a poor area, and the impact on poor folks is pretty extreme. And that's not to say that we don't need some sort of controls on ground pumping, but it does argue that we need to find ways to get water to people who need it most. So I also talk about desalination, which is a costly form of water. There's the plant in San Diego County, which has ended up, I think, providing like 8 or 9% of the county's water supply, and it provides a consistent supply of water, even though it's pricier. But that technology is advancing and the price is coming down, and the price of other forms of water are going up. So we're going to see it's going to get a lot closer in pricing. But a similar plant, almost identical plant in Huntington Beach, has been held up by the California Coastal Commission over concerns about plankton and the way that the plant draws the water from the ocean. But plankton it's pretty hard to believe that the plankton isn't just a proxy for the bigger concern about growth. And I've read what environmental groups have said, and they just seem to oppose virtually everything. Now, I'm not saying that you put cost effectiveness aside. You look at cost effectiveness,
Sure.
but they seem to be geared up to oppose everything. The governor did just replace a water board member who seemed to be opposed to the desal plant. So that might bode well for its approval. I wrote recently about a proposed desal plant in Marina near Monterey, and that the environmental groups under the banner of environmental justice had been opposing that. And yet, there's such a high demand for water in that area that the current system is depleting the rivers. So desal would provide additional water. I have a section on Israel and how they the 6-day war. I didn't realize it till I was doing research for the book, was fought largely over water.
Yep.
And so that's an actual shooting war over water. Anyway, Israel in a short period of time, relying almost entirely on desal, has been able to actually be a net exporter of water and to fill up their reservoirs with desalinated ocean water. It's costly, but it certainly has taken them from the precarious situation they have, and it's a much more arid place than California.
Yeah. I mean, also one of the big points you talk about is putting a price on water, which to some might raise alarm bells, but can you kind of talk about the idea behind that?
Yeah, I mean, water pricing is the way we provide, we get any commodity to its highest and best use is pricing it appropriately. And so I have a whole chapter on the need for better pricing. There's a decision tree on the book that shows what kind of regulatory hurdles companies have to go through if they want to trade water. And it's like one of those Rube Goldberg contraptions where you got this goes to this and then this approval, and it's really subjective. And we don't have a sophisticated computerized pricing model. And the result is it takes too long. I mean, if you wanted to sell a stock and you weren't sure you'd be able to do it until it got approval 6 to 8 months from now, it would certainly limit your ability to do that sort of trade. And that's what happens in water. And the market, the weather conditions vary greatly. So we need a better system. Australia has actually embraced a water pricing model. I explain it in some detail in the book, but it's problematic, and it's a good idea in general, but the way they implemented it, I found to be problematic. They did it in a way similar to our cap and trade system, where there's a cap on the amount of water, and then so they're starting from a position of scarcity, and then government ends up having the most power to buy the water for environmental uses. So that hasn't worked out as well as it's not the system that I would promote. I quote from a Western Governors Association report, which points for the need for better pricing to help move water around, buy and sell the water, but ultimately we need more storage, and we need more we need to feed more water into the system. I talk about the Cadiz project in the Mojave Desert. There's a Rhode Island-sized aquifer that a private company wants to tap and put into the Colorado River aqueduct. And Senator Feinstein has opposed that in Congress, and our state legislature and the governor recently signed a law that imposes a whole new set of regulatory hurdles over something that, from all the reports I looked at, doesn't seem to have any negative environmental impact. So it seems as if we need to do more of these kind of projects. Now, Orange County's, and this one, environmentalists seem to be favorably disposed to, is having they have a real boisterous water recycling project. So, the water doesn't go directly. Critics used to call it toilet to tap, which is terrible, because the water is cleaner. It's cleaner than anything else. They have to actually add minerals back into it to give it some sort of taste. It has to percolate in the ground for, I think, 6 months before it's used. But the state is promoting more vigorous use of these sort of recycling, which is an extremely good idea. And
I believe the politically correct term is non-potable water, if you don't want to offend anybody.
No, but it will be potable once
Yeah.
yeah. So the purple pipes, there's some, like Fresno, they have a system where they use recycled water for irrigation purposes. But this has a lot of promise. So those sorts of projects that can feed more water into the system. It's so more of everything, fixing up the infrastructure, developing desalination, water recycling, capturing more stormwater in Southern California. And, as far as fish, we need to restore habitats so that the fish will thrive. Just flushing more water through the rivers doesn't necessarily improve the habitats. And our government agencies have been laser focused simply on providing more water, sending more water out to the sea, and less concerned about reviving habitats. And I've also I went into the book being somewhat skeptical of the tunnels project, but I really became convinced of the need to fix the conveyance system through the Delta, which wouldn't necessarily provide more water to the south, but it's like like one water district official said, it's like a 6-lane highway going into a bunch of dirt roads, and then another highway at the end. So I think a better conveyance. But of course, I also tell the story of the peripheral canal, and which was quite the political blunder. But there does seem to be some need for a fix.
Before we get to our last question, I just wanted to do a couple minutes on the Delta, because I think we'd be remiss if we didn't hit it. I think we've hit everything else. Maybe give us an overview of the canal, maybe how the canal project went from 2 to 1, and the role of the Delta.
Yeah, I mean, the Delta, it's the West Coast's largest estuary, and there's like 1,000 miles of waterway in that area, and we need a system for one archaic article that I had quoted from compared it to like bypass surgery. Just the Brown administration and the Schwarzenegger administration had proposed the twin tunnels that would help bring the water through there. Because when the Delta smelt when Delta smelt are trapped at the pumps in Tracy, it shuts down the water supply. So the goal is to provide a more reliable form of water, not necessarily more water, but that would enable, and the Delta Fix project would have restored some of the habitats, which is perhaps a better way to deal with the fish population problem than simply trying to fight over water for people or water for fish. But you move the water through and you fix some of the fish habitats, and that area is with the subsidence in the area and the saltwater intrusion from the Pacific, it's just a troubled environmental area. So Metropolitan Water District had championed that project, but in going down to one tunnel, as the governor has proposed, it's questionable whether it's even economically feasible, and not even sure if it's politically feasible at this point.
Yeah, I think that's. I remember talking to one person from DWR, and they said this is when it looked like, oh, they're going to do the twin tunnels. This is before Jerry Brown was almost out. And they said that'll never get built. And they've been trying to build that since the 1960s or 70s. And it's just been this, I don't know if third rail is the right word, but a water boogeyman that won't go away for sure.
Well, these days, I think it could take longer to do an environmental impact report for a project than it took to build the entire state water project. So it's always about politics. But the general focus of the book is that we need to we need to have a political focus on creating water abundance rather than managing scarcity. And
Yeah, I mean, my final question was, how do we get there? What, with all these political impediments, all the regulations in the way, how do we get to where California has more water?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I talk about the state water project and how the Santa Barbara area did not want to tap into it, but I think it was in the 90s when they had, after a severe drought, all of a sudden the public decided on the importance of tapping into the state water project, and likewise in San Diego. The public was aghast at the idea of the water recycling, which is where the toilet to tap name came from. And yet it's not a problem anymore. They're developing their own pure water system, is what they call it. So I think when the public is faced with scarcity and the alternative is extreme conservation and even rationing, I think we're going to build a public consensus around the need for at least modestly expanding our infrastructure and expanding, some of these other projects that'll feed more water into the system.
Absolutely. Well, Steve, we're about at time. I just wanted to throw a quick pitch for your book. You can go on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, but I'll leave the last word to you.
Yeah. So winning the water wars, and it's been an interesting time researching it and learning about California water, and I even refer to Cadillac Desert and Mark Reisner's approach towards turning more of the West into letting it go wild, and I argue against that approach, even though his book's a wonderful book, obviously. That we just need to focus more on developing our water resources for people and protecting the environment as we do it. And I think both goals could be accomplished at the same time. So hopefully.
And real quick, correct me if I'm wrong, you took all the pictures in the book you went and took at the different facilities across the state, right?
Yeah, most we used a few stock photos, but I took most of the photos, and that was a lot of fun.
That needs to be your follow-up book, is just your journey to take all the pictures.
Yeah, right. As COVID was closing in on us, I was rushing around taking pictures. So yeah.
All right. Well, Steve, hey, thanks for being here. It's a good talk. I'm sure we could spend many more hours talking about water, but thanks for giving us a preview in the book. I hope folks go to Amazon and pick it up. It's a really wonderful book and a good intro to players in water policy, the ideas, and where things stand in California. So thanks for being here, Steve.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Take care.